Back in the 90s, to me, the Sega Genesis always felt like a very logical successor to the Grafx. The controller had a similar layout, the library had a similar focus on the darker, weirder, and more experimental sorts of games that I liked, and the whole vibe had a similar sort of edge to it, which very much appealed to my 6-7-year-old boy brain, and still does. So, before I knew it, I had put the turbo pad down in favor of the old Batarang. Compared to the Turbo's library, though, the Genesis felt bottomless. Even today, I'm still occasionally discovering games I've never heard of and rediscovering games that I forgot about for 20 years. And even with all the hidden gem videos and forum posts and everything that's come up over the years, I still feel like there's a lot of really good Genesis games that just aren't brought up much at all. So I guess that's where I come in, right? Here, I want to bring up some games that I think are pretty great but aren't talked about very often, and that fans of the Genesis should at least try out for the first time, if not maybe give a second chance. Dinosaurs for Hire started out as a somewhat promising comic book, and almost made its way to being an animated TV show. Somewhere along the way, though, the IP fell apart. Despite the large presence of dinosaurs in early 90s pop culture, the Dinosaurs for Hire show never got off the ground, the comic series got cancelled, and we'd be left with a lone Sega Genesis game to remember them by. I can't speak as to why this IP never really took off, but I can speak to the game. And some rough edges aside, I think it absolutely qualifies as a hidden gem. Ultimately, what we have here is a pretty solid attempt at sort of a Contra-style side-scrolling shooter/platformer. Developed in-house at Sega and released around the middle of the Genesis lifespan, the game plays pretty well. While it's not nearly as good as the better run-and-guns of its time, I still enjoy this one quite a bit. It's got a ton of edgy 90s personality and a good sense of humor. Case in point, where it fakes you out right here at the beginning with kind of a non-ending for no real reason other than to just be absurd. Now, I suppose I am a little bit biased towards this game because games like this really take me back to the 90s like very few can. 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old me really dug these slightly edgy, anthropomorphized animal characters. Ninja Turtles, Street Sharks, Sonic, Battletoads, and these guys really held my attention for a long time, and still do, I guess. But I really don't think it's all nostalgia goggles. Dinosaurs for Hire packs a genuine punch in most of the areas that you'd want it to. For instance, the graphics are usually pretty great. The levels often look and feel more like what you would see from more popular franchises, with distinct designs and lots of variety between them, like the dual-layered subway level here, and the almost entirely vertical cavern stage, which I think looks pretty awesome, with a cool arrangement of colors, lightning flashes, and parallax scrolling layers in the background. I also like this one, that I guess is a giant kaiju movie set, where you're being attacked by all the fake tanks and planes, although I guess they're not fake since they're attacking you. I don't know, it doesn't make any sense, but it's alright. Not every stage looks great though. In fact, a couple of them are downright drab, but most of them have something cool going on that keeps them interesting. I also like the character designs, though they are taken right out of the Battletoads playbook of throwing on some cool guy jackets and sunglasses on humanoid animals and calling it a day, but if it works, it works. Speaking of the Battletoads playbook, this stage pretty blatantly tries to do their own version of the turbo tunnel, and it's not as good. Although it can be beaten within a few tries and doesn't make me want to throw my controller through a wall, which is more than I can say about the turbo tunnel. The music here also has some above-average moments, with an edgy punk rock feel to it that definitely fits the aesthetic about as snugly as it could. Although at the same time, it doesn't really stand out beyond that. The music does its job, you're just not going to be listening to it outside of the game or anything. Plus, the few tracks that are here are reused a little bit more than I would have liked. A couple more unique tunes to fit the variety of the levels themselves would have been nice, but it is what it is. The action itself is pretty standard, to be honest. My only real gripe with it though is that enemies can end up behind your character where you can't shoot them, but they can continue doing damage to you, which is super annoying. Now, you do have a melee attack that can deal with them in these instances, but it's kind of a sluggish attack to use and opens you up to the next enemy, which is usually right there, since they tend to come at you in quick succession. Eventually you're going to want to get into the flow of just shooting enemies that are far away and readying a melee attack for the ones that get close. Even then though, the large character sprites always make you an easy target for wayward enemy bullets. Going prone can help mitigate that a little bit, but your hitbox is still really big, so you'll just need to get used to that. The weapon variety here is also pretty minimal, with only a couple of different upgrade paths for the same gun, and nothing really changes between the three characters, which is definitely a missed opportunity to make their personalities stand out a little bit more. The shooting itself is pretty good though, with diagonal shooting and really high jumps giving you at least one or two ways to hit most targets on screen, especially if you have the spread shot going, which you should definitely hang on to as long as possible. These dino dudes control pretty well overall, though the controls aren't quite as tight as, say, Gunstar Heroes. With that, combined with the large character sprites, I guess you could say this game feels more like RoboCop vs. Terminator than Contra. Though the heavy reliance on going prone throughout the game does feel vaguely Contra-like, so it's kind of a mix of both, I guess. Dinosaurs for Hire might not approach the upper tier of its genre, but if you like these sorts of games and want something a little bit different, you could do a whole lot worse. The large boss battles, the good variety of levels, and a two-player mode make it a solid choice in my view, and a great example of the kind of good old-fashioned side-scrolling shooter fun that you could only really get on the Genesis. One of the many things I love about the Sega Genesis is its abundance of games that just sort of feel like their own thing and defy classification. Haunting, starring Poltergeist, is absolutely one of those games. Given that, I won't even try to label it, other than to say that it is a one-of-a-kind game and a massive hidden gem in the Genesis library. Poltergeist here is a teenage skater punk dude who died from a faulty skateboard manufactured by Vito Sardini's company, so naturally, as a ghost, he takes it upon himself to haunt the entire Sardini family until they move away, and then scare them out of the next house too, and continue terrorizing them out of their homes for, I guess, forever, or until they die. I'm actually not sure what the real end goal here is, but he's getting revenge for the faulty skateboard, you get the idea. Successful hauntings are achieved by possessing various objects around the house and chasing this uppity family around until they give up and run out. Seems like a little overboard to also scare the kids, I guess. They didn't really do anything wrong, but well. Screw it! The scares themselves are the most entertaining part of the game. Each room is full of different items you can possess and queue up for a haunting, and the vast majority of them are pretty awesome. Some of them are goofy, some of them are downright horrifying, and others are just disturbing. And to be fair, a few of them are kind of lame, but the giant variety of these scares and the ridiculous reactions of the family members to them make haunting a uniquely fun time. There's not a whole lot to it gameplay-wise, and there's not a whole lot of strategy, but I defy anyone to play this game and not at least find it amusing, if for nothing else, than to just see what sort of mad and macabre awaits in the next room, and the next house. Some objects you can control in real time too, which I think are the most fun ones to do. Not many games let you float around as a laughing skull and terrify a child in their own bedroom. Most of them are automatic though, and get added to sort of a queue once you jump back out of them. When their turn comes up, the object vibrates and attracts whoever's in the room, and then hits them with whatever horrible mutation that they have in store. You'd think after a while they'd learn to avoid vibrating objects, but I don't know, I guess they're stupid. Once they've had enough, they leave the room and you get to collect a glob of ectoplasm for every scare you got. Again, there's not a whole lot of strategy with the scares, other than trying to make sure you get as many as you can as quickly as you can to keep your ecto up. Although I will say the objects with a gold shimmer will basically always get a scare immediately no matter what else is happening, so I save those for when the person is running out of the room to squeeze in one more scare before they're gone. Every little bit of ecto counts. There's a little bit more depth perhaps in the fact that the family members are scattered all around the house, making you come up with the most efficient paths between them and the handful of little spells that you can use to tilt the table in your favor a little bit more, like being able to possess one person and go scare another. Or one where you can materialize for a little bit and throw bombs at them and get a couple scares without having to possess anything. these abilities definitely add some variety, but honestly, I'm usually having too much fun with the scares themselves, and I forget about them. The family dog can also make your ecto deplete faster, so he's sort of an ongoing monkey wrench that can interrupt your flow. That said, you can't really fail at these stages per se. As long as you're getting scares, the family will eventually leave the house and you'll eventually beat the level. Your ecto will also eventually run out, and when that happens, you're taken to one of these dungeon levels where you have to make your way to the exit while avoiding giant muscular hands that reach out of walls and other random hazards while collecting ecto along the way. Here, Poltergeist can actually die, sending you back to the beginning of the game. Every hit takes a little bit away from his health down here, and outside of just a couple very missable opportunities to replenish it, this is all you've got to get through the whole game. So the best strategy is to just avoid coming down here as much as possible, not just because these levels can actually end the game, but also because, in my opinion, they're not super fun, and actually get kinda tedious after the 4th or 5th time. I do like the music down here though. Kinda reminds me of something you'd hear in a Splatterhouse game. That said, it is probably for the best that these levels aren't very long. As the game goes on, Poltergeist has more to worry about. Floating demon head things that attack and eat the ecto left by the living become a common nuisance, although you can take them out with just a few jump kicks. And that family dog does get increasingly aggressive and sometimes even follows you around. I really hate this dog. After a handful of houses are vacated, the game culminates into a pretty random boss fight with robot-legged brain things that look like something Plankton would have made, though I do kind of enjoy this boss fight, despite it making zero sense whatsoever. But anyway, the real reason to play this game is for the goofy scares, and to see how fast you can drive these ding-dongs out of their increasingly fancy houses. Or at least that's what I enjoy about it. I'd say Haunting is a pretty good-looking game too. The graphics aren't what I would call top-notch for their time, but the isometric angles and good variety of layouts and color schemes for the different houses make the graphics pop and definitely keep your attention. Also, again, the sheer number of random, gruesome, and bizarre animations throughout the game are quite the spectacle. Some of them are kind of shocking, and I'm kind of surprised that they made it into the game. Kinda makes me wonder what didn't make it into the game. Either way though, good on Electronic Arts for letting the developers go so wild with it. It definitely made the game stand out. The sound might not fare quite as well though. I like the music okay, as it fits the spooky mood with sort of a subtle approach, and many of the sound effects are pretty good, though it doesn't take long to notice that multiple sounds are getting reused a lot, which I suppose might just be part of the price that we had to pay for so many animations being in the game, though it can still take some of the wind out of them when you recognize a sound effect for the 15th time. Overall, the value of Haunting lies in the unique concept and the thoughtful execution of it. The developers had a great idea for a game and went for it, and I think they really achieved something special here. Another Genesis game that defies the norms of its genre is Devilish, a demonic-themed Arkanoid-style brick-breaker game that has above-average graphics and music, and plays pretty well despite a little bit of jank and a wildly fluctuating frame rate. Lots of people liken this one to Devil's Crush on the Turbo, and I can definitely see why. It takes a classic formula and drenches it in occult themes, and even packs in a few extra twists, like the ability to control two paddles at once, one that stays horizontal on the bottom, and the top one that can go up and down and turn 90 degrees in both directions. This is so you can direct the ball towards certain targets and guide it through the game's many horizontal sections. The latter is what you'll largely use this ability for though, since trying to use the paddles to hit certain things nets inconsistent results a lot of the time, which I guess you could say is a weak point for the game. The physics in general are a bit on the wonky side actually, and that coupled with the frame rate that really likes to slow down and speed up seemingly at random can definitely lead to some annoying moments. That said, if you let go of whatever ideas of strategy you might have gone into the game with and just roll with the punches a little bit, there's a ton of fun to be had with Devilish. The enemies are a lot of fun to take on, as some of them will fly around the screen and even attack your ball, so they can take priority over progressing through the level a lot of the time, and that keeps things interesting. Most levels even have some alternate pathways, which can add a fair amount of replay value. Starting these over after losing all your lives can sometimes be a blessing in disguise, as you very well might discover that a different route might work a lot better, and might even be objectively superior with more high-scoring blocks and power-ups that you wouldn't have come across otherwise. The power-ups themselves aren't anything revolutionary, and largely resemble things that you've seen in other brick breakers, like temporarily making your paddles bigger, giving the ball the ability to smash through multiple blocks in a row, etc. But they do add just enough spice that they're worth seeking out and snatching up. Quick shout out to the horizontal sections too. It's not an idea that feels particularly well executed, but it definitely goes a long way to keeping you on your toes and adding a ton of variety to the levels. Some sections even have you protecting the bottom and sides of the screen at the same time, which really works out your brain in a way that few games do. It can be a bit much, but I kinda like the mental workout. The boss battles are perhaps the most fun parts of the game. Each one plays out differently and tests different aspects of your skills, or lack thereof. Again, the wonky physics and random performance dips do work against you at certain times, but the game is still just too much fun to be dragged down by that, at least in my opinion. Even at its worst, Devilish keeps my attention with the drastically different stages and extremely good music, neither of which are at the top of their class, but it's all well above average. I really dig the music in particular, lots of deep bass rumbling through each song, giving the whole game a super heavy, dramatic sound. Now don't get it twisted, it does not hold a candle to Devil's Crush, but again, it's still a well above average soundtrack. An area where I'm not particularly impressed is the sound effects. Most of them are pretty standard Sega Genesis sounds, with very little dynamic or stylistic variation, so they don't really do much more than the bare minimum for explosions or other things that could have come off way more impactful. Not a big deal, but it is something that I tend to notice in light of how good every other aspect of the presentation is. So yeah, Devilish might be in the same family as Devil's Crush, but it's more of a distant cousin than a sibling. I'd actually be more likely to recommend it to fans of Drop-Off than the Crush games, but that's just me. Either way, I do consider this a hidden gem for the system, even though it's clearly not for everyone and does have its flaws. There's not much else out there quite like it, and if you think you would enjoy it, you probably would. B.O.B. or Bob is a game that rarely gets mentioned at all, just like whatever Bob stands for. I almost never see this game get brought up, and while I sort of get why, there's not a whole lot to it at the end of the day, I still think it's a solid shooter platformer with a weighty feel and a cool look to it. This game really exemplifies what I love about the Sega Genesis library. There's all these weird, charming little games just kind of scattered throughout the library that nobody really talks about. But they're out there, waiting for people to come across them. But anyway, Bob's a teenager who speaks almost exclusively in 90s slang and catchphrases, and he's on a mission to get off the asteroid that he's crashed on, pick up his date, and do other Bob stuff. That asteroid, though, has a lot of enemies and platforming challenges, and also a few different weapons and other gadgets that conveniently help Bob get around and take out enemies a little more handily. I really like the character design of Bob a lot. He's got a lot of silliness to him, but he's not a total goofball either. Lots of fun little animations, like his crouch movement and his antenna fingers, give him a lot of personality. He's kind of somewhere between Earthworm Jim and Bug on the Saturn. And again, I just feel like he's very emblematic of the Sega Genesis in a lot of ways, even though this game almost never comes up. Given that Bob is more or less a run and gun, I can see how it ended up being an acquired taste for a lot of people, since it's not nearly as fast and smooth as Gunstar Heroes or Contra Hardcore. Bob controls a little slower and feels like he's got some heft to him that you might not expect. There's also not a whole lot of freedom in how you accomplish things most of the time. The levels are extremely linear and corridory, and there's usually only one way through them. That said, later on, some levels open up and allow a little more variance. And there are the occasional spots here and there where you can find hidden items, but generally Bob's levels are pretty straight up, not much in the way of frills, bells, or whistles. The music is a high point for me in this game. There aren't as many tunes as I would like, but the handful that are here are pretty catchy and well done, and very Sega Genesis-y. Lots of scratchy metallic instrumentation and a nice thick low end makes the music stand out. Nothing revolutionary, but some of the tunes will absolutely get stuck in your head, and that's a good sign. The graphics in B.O.B are also quite good, especially B.O.B himself, and the enemy designs. It all looks great, and the levels have some nice spots that are straight up outstanding, though the levels repeat the same few design concepts for so long before they change that they tend to overstay their welcome to some extent. So even though I tend to want to see something new well before the game is really ready to do that, I still like them. B.O.B also gets deceptively difficult, and a couple of levels that try to mix things up, like this one here, are just a little bit more challenging and obtuse than they needed to be, but overall I think the level variety is okay. I cannot say that B.O.B is a game that I feel motivated to play from front to back every time I turn it on, but I can say that it's more than worth the hour or so of time I do put into it before being distracted by something else. I can also say that it's not really given its due and clearly has more going for it than most give it credit for. Lots of game developers were trying to have their own version of Sonic on the Genesis. Some of them worked, a lot of them didn't, but one of the better attempts at cashing in on this idea came from the folks at Data East with High Seas Havoc. This game switches out the hedgehog for a seal, of all things, and has a pirate theme over everything to set it apart from the tin heads and the sockets of its time, and overall I'd say it's demonstrably better than those games and most other attempts at a Sonic-y type game on the Genesis. Havoc the Seal is rescuing his family from the evil walrus Bernardo, who's also looking to steal a powerful gem. Not a Chaos Emerald at all, totally different. The Sonic similarities don't stop there though. Movement has kind of a momentum factor. Levels have springs and ramps and slopes and whatnot, and collecting 100 gems, can get you an extra life. And you even get shoes that make you temporarily faster. So it's pretty shameless in that regard. And also, like the original Sonic games, many of the levels here aren't actually designed to facilitate jumping and speeding around willy-nilly like you might think. You'll definitely take damage and lose lives very quickly if you play the game that way. When you get down to it, this is actually a rather challenging platformer that takes some serious precision at times. I find this level of challenge to actually be a good fit for the controls and level layouts though. It's tough, but pretty finely tuned. Havoc feels good to control, with predictable jumps and responsive movement, so it always feels good to jump around and bop enemies on the head, even though a few of them are prone to getting some cheap hits in here and there. That's probably my only real gripe with the gameplay though. And I guess it'd be nice if the jump kick attack were just a little bit more useful. It's such a wimpy little kick that it barely does anything and is only actually useful in certain situations, like boss battles where it's the only way to actually hurt them. Outside of that though, I'd say High Seas Havoc is a well above average platformer for its time and even today. It's got a great sense of variety with level types, with some of them having a lot of verticality, some containing intense platforming gauntlets, and no one concept being worn out to the point of getting boring. They're all really good-looking levels too. This fire level in particular is a major standout to me. I love the fiery background effects and the constant pressure of this sentient fireball keeping you moving forward. Most stages reward curiosity too, and feature alternate pathways and hidden items everywhere. Do some exploring and you're sure to come across extra lives, score boosts, tons of gems, and those speedy shoes that you don't really need most of the time. Enemy variety is really good too, even though, again, some of them are kind of annoying. This game isn't as good as the Sonic games that it's so clearly trying to emulate, but it's in the general ballpark, I'd say. Most of the levels are gorgeous, with multiple scrolling background layers and lots of bright colors, and the music is solid, albeit not quite amazing. Most importantly though, it's a fun, well-made game. Data East took a big swing at a Sonic-style platformer, and I think they largely got it right. It definitely smacks you around a little bit with tough platforming sections and tricky bosses, but honestly I feel like if it were as easy as most games in the genre, it wouldn't stand out as much. Clearly, a lot of effort went into High Seas Havoc, and I'm kind of shocked it's not talked about more than it is. If you're a fan of the genre or Genesis games in general, you've got to give it a try and maybe give it a little bit of time to grow on you. It's definitely worth it. There's actually a bunch more Genesis games that I think would be a perfect fit for this, but I think that's going to do it for now. Hopefully I've been able to make the case for giving some of these games a second chance, or maybe showed you something you haven't even heard of. The Genesis library is quite the rabbit hole though, so feel free to suggest some other obscure games that maybe I didn't mention, because I'm always in the market for that sort of thing. And if this video does halfway decent, maybe I'll bring them up in a part 2. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.